Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast where we work hard towards ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I am joined, of course, by Terry Robinson. Today we're going to give you another episode of Tomes of Magic, and before we get into it, I'm going to open it up for a few announcements. I got one myself. I've been hanging out a little bit on our podcast Discord, which we encourage you to visit to chat with all of us. And there was a person there who was working on his own set of paradox rules that he wanted to use instead of those published in Mage 20. He wanted to get a little more into it, add a little more. And so he was telling me about it. And so I submitted, typed up a couple of pages of my ideas on Paradox and sent it off to him. Now, he didn't exactly ask me for my input, but I'm sure it'll be fine. What's worse that can happen here, right? So, Terry, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I am thrilled, just to go back to what you said, the profusion of fan ideas that we have. I think a lot of people have realized that it may be a while until we get a Mage 5th edition. So we got maybe a couple of years where we get to fill in some blanks. And discord.me/Mates of the Podcast, we have a bunch of those batting around. Some alternative rules for Paradox, some alternative setting ideas, some options for a potential M5 conversion. I'm working on my own projects, and that's been a hoot. And one of them has been taking the convention one-shot I do and turning that into a Storyteller Vault publication. And one of the things you hear is you can't do a canned adventure for Mage. And my goal is to prove everyone right by publishing something and then making it that and having no one buy it because everyone's like, no, you can't do this. But yeah, I ran a bunch of games at Gen Con again. That was a hoot. It is always a joy to take someone who has never experienced anything involving the world of darkness and to be like, oh yes, you have heard of vampire, but what about this large purple book that nobody quite understands? How about that? So I got to run that for 15 people. So that is kind of my current side project. If conventions ever happen again, I plan to continue to do that. So yeah, definitely. One-shots for role-playing games are important as a means of giving publicity to a game, introducing new people to a game, but it can be a bit frustrating because as a storyteller who talks to other storytellers, I have noticed this trend that all the storytellers want feedback from their players. They want to know, they're always asking, am I a good storyteller? How can I become a better storyteller? And one-shots are a lot of fun because at the end of a one-shot, naturally, just, maybe force a habit or something, the storyteller turns to his players and says, so how was that? I mean, how about, a little feedback before you go. And the players are always, oh, sure, you're great. Let me just stuff my stuff in my backpack and get out of here really quick. And the storyteller is always left with the thought, are they just being polite? Or I don't know. But it's nice of them to say something. And it's kind of the opposite of when you get some people and some friends and, you bring them over to your place and you run a session for them and you ask them, so how was that? What do you think? And they say, my sick grandmother's a better storyteller than you. Oh, great. Thanks for that. Same time next week. Yeah. Yeah, of course. Wouldn't miss it for anything. I try and be very specific with the feedback I'm requesting. That's been one of my tactics to go against that, where it's like sometimes there is certainly that, oh yeah, that was the best ancient pan flute recital I've ever been to. Oh yeah, definitely. I'll totally do this next year. And then they give you like a fake name and indicate that their email address is bobbyteenager@mail.com or something like that. And they're like, maybe not.
Yeah.
So what we're reading today, Adam?
Well, today it is Tomes of Magic, and we are getting into The Spirit Ways. This is towards the tail end of second edition. There's only one more book after this before we charge into revised edition. There's a 27 on the spine. It was put out in 1999. We got 110 pages, 4 authors. And, of course, this was developed by Jesse Heinig, who is getting comfortable in the developer's chair and getting ready for a revised edition to be out for everyone. So this book was interesting to me because it is all about, the Spirit Ways, about shamans and about spirit magic and magic that specializes on the spirit sphere in Mage the Ascension. Even though we had a big talk about shamans in the first tradition book, Dream Speakers, which we have an episode on. You can go back and review that if you're interested in this topic. In this book, they wanted to add a lot more material, and they wanted to give a new take on shamans. And so one thing that Terry and I were discussing, we weren't actually certain if this book wanted to revise shamans in Mage or if it wanted to add another kind of shaman. just real quick, the traditional shaman that we get in the past is just one who specializes in the spirit sphere. They're very attuned to what's going on in the spirit world. They're very involved in the give and take and respecting spirits and making themselves a part of the spirit world instead of putting a leash around it and controlling it. Now, this book takes its cue from a lot of old traditions of, I guess you could say occult and real world magical beliefs around different cultures, and that is that a shaman will very, very closely connect to one spirit that they call a totem in this book, and that totem spirit will have a very intimate relationship with the shaman. It will teach the shaman, tell the shaman what to do. The shaman has a very closely linked responsibility to it, and because of that, it helps them get more involved in the spirit world, and so they get some advantages and disadvantages that I would say standard shamans don't get. I use the terms standard shaman and totem shaman just to sort of help me differentiate, but I invented those terms. In the book, they just say shaman. Let's open it up for a walkthrough of this 110-page book. Terry, can you help me out here?
So the first thing I would like to note is when we crack this sucker open, we see a credits page that I don't remember the last time I saw this much white space on a credits page. There's no special thank you. There's no little inside joke. There's no extraneous bits at the bottom. It is a little tight bolus of text indicating who did what, and then the book starts. This was a case of the Hounds of the Baskerville, the dog that didn't bark, me noticing something that wasn't there. And I was like, whoa, Terry, put on your mage pants. We're in a different part of Magetown.
So in the first part of Magetown, you weren't wearing pants? Or
correct.
Just trying to get this. Okay.
Correct.
Right.
That was a very first edition vibe. And then second edition is pants. And then when we get to revise, that is dress pants with a belt. We get to the prelude, which is about a guy who is going to be beaten up by the most stereotypical, zombie cultists ever imagined. And he thinks he's going to die, but there is a cockroach there. And he gives the cockroach a small piece of jerky, and he turns into his alter ego, Cockroach Man. And he just beats the living snot out of some people. The introductory fiction gives you a case of both the power and the oddness of what it is like to be a shaman of this type, where a small offering is given, the spirit comes over the character. In this case, literally hordes of cockroaches just force their way into this character's body, and then he beats up another shaman, kind of as the avatar, lowercase a, or agent of his totem spirit. I liked it. I found it engaging, and I think it did a good job of being like, oh man, this is maybe different than the presentation that we've had so far in Mage. What did you think about it, Adam?
The prelude was interesting for me for two things that I noted after finishing it. And one is they wanted to explain in the early chapters of the book that shamans in traditional cultures have really been odd man out in their culture, in their village. They are the weird guy, but he's got a weird job to do, so he has to be that way. And this story really emphasized that. It does a good job of emphasizing how shamans, even among mages, even among other traditional members of their ethnic group or cultural group, they stand out. The other thing is, he's got a little, leftover beef jerky in his pocket. He gives it to the cockroach spirit. The cockroach spirit then wipes out another mage and that mage's henchman and lets the guy escape. And so it kind of suggests the idea of, okay, I know that in shamans in the spirit realm there's give and take, but as storytellers it's nice to pay attention to how much give and how much take. Because if you give I got a pack of peanuts in my pocket here, spirit, go wipe out all my enemies. It's like, is this the kind of game balance I'm looking for?
Yeah, I worked with the presumption that the cockroach spirit already had a beef with whatever the other entity was. So it was one of those, I want to go mess up this guy and all of his friends. And the beef jerky just kind of put a bow on the deal. But the
tipping point.
Yeah. So the thing I didn't get about chapter 1, and I hope there is a secret meaning behind this, is that the word one does not appear to be capitalized in chapter 1. And in all the other chapters, chapter X, the X is capitalized. It's like that in the table of contents as well. And that threw me off. The opening of chapter 1 gives you a whole bunch of in-world examples of shamanic practices that exist around the world of darkness. And this is something that we saw in the Dream Speaker walkthrough, where instead of just saying, I'm a dream speaker, let's go dream speak, it said, here are 10 different traditions that the dream speakers call from, and I'm going to discuss what a dream speaker does through the lens of each one of these. This does the same thing, where it talks about the shamanic practices of the high northern latitudes, the shamanic practices of East Asia, those that are being done in the depths of the Amazon, those from sub-Saharan Africa and from other regions of the world. And then it attempts to go over what the basics of the shamanic practice is. And it comes out very quickly that the goal of the shaman, especially in modern life, is to act as an intermediary between our world and the spirit world, and to attend to matters that no one else quite knows how to deal with. You got a cold that won't quite go away? You should probably talk to a shaman. You've got your car keys keep disappearing? Talk to a shaman. You're having difficulty making closure with the passage of one of your parents? Go talk to a shaman. And how in a lot of modernity, everything has been kind of put into convenient buckets of, if you have this kind of illness, you go to see this kind of doctor to get this kind of problem, that the shaman doesn't fit neatly into that. There's also a reminder that being a shaman is not easy, that it will often be uncomfortable to do all these other things, but hopefully will be rewarding. And then it kind of goes through the process of becoming a shaman. And this is one of those cases where it is fascinating, but to me, overly specific. For instance, they say that all shamans will have some sort of illness initially that does not go away until they deal with it by reaching out to the spirit world in some way, or the spirit world reveals itself. And this is a part where the book's like, some people never address it and then they just die. But in the world of darkness, that's fine. You're probably going to come back and maybe the next version of you gets to do a better job. There is a initiation of some sort once you are able to realize that you are being called to the shamanic lifestyle, because in this layout of things, it is very much a calling. It is something that the world comes to you demanding that you do. There is some sort of part where you are symbolically killed and reborn, and boy howdy, are the ways that they explain that pretty amazing. In one case, you are broken down by 3 smiths who will pound away at your bones and inner workings for 3 years before being reforged. In another case, you are boiled alive in a pot until that is decanted and then reformed to create the new self. But needless to say, it's going to hurt. It may take a while, but you're going to come out the other end a new kind of person. It talks about the connection that you will eventually make with a totem spirit of some sort, that along the way you will call to an animal, or a animal will call unto you, or maybe a non-animal entity. You will get a special bond that will carry with you through the rest of your life, and also that you need to practice. That one of the things that is notable about being a shaman is, one, it's not easy to do it full time in most contemporary cultures, so you should probably do something else. I like that they point out that construction workers and plumbers are disproportionately represented among shaman to keep you in connection with earth and water. And if contemporary city plumbing is your way of staying connected with the element of water, that's an interesting choice. That's all I'm going to say. Then it talks about, once you have become a shaman, some of the things that you can start expecting to happen. One is you will gain access to some sort of inner place of calm, which they refer to as the spirit lake, which is the inner reserve of power that a shaman can call on. That you have 2 places that power can emanate from. One is your connection to the spirit world and your willingness to exchange services and to lean on both deeds that you will do and deeds that you have done to get spirits to aid you, as well as this inner reserve of power. And one of the things that this book makes clear is that while they are saying that the experience of becoming a shaman is somewhat unified, you will have the spiritual illness, you will have some sort of call to power, you will in some way be reborn. It very much opens up the manifestations of that. The rest of this chapter is just examples of shamanic practitioners and they're going out in the world, of dealing with the sick, of encountering other mages, of little promises that they owe to other shaman. And then it just closes with kind of what it's like to be in the contemporary world and be at something like a wedding and then have the spirit call on you to do something. I think the chapter did a good job of setting things up, of giving a lot of examples. It had me doing a lot of Wikipedia searching as I was going through to be like, what? I don't even know what continent this is from. So that kind of tipped my hand as to my ignorance for a number of these topics. But then chapter 1 wound down.
After reading this many mage books, I think I'm allowed to nitpick. And one is it refers to Doisatep twice as if it was still there. And it's like, yeah, that fell 2 years ago. Doisatep is really, really broken. What was interesting for me about this book and the way it was put together was in chapter 1, you get a couple of references of these kinds of shamans saying, we are not dream speakers. Those dream speakers over there, they're a different group. And then you get to the middle chapters of the book and it says, yeah, a lot of these kind of totem shamans are dream speakers, but there's also a lot that are not dream speakers. Like, okay, so it's like, you know, a little different from what we got in chapter 1. And then you get to the appendix and it's talking about dream speakers. You know, dream speakers do this. Dream speakers have this. It's like, okay, I understand, but it would have been nice to kind of even this out and make it a little understandable. The impression was there from reading a lot of these in-character fiction pieces in chapter 1 that a lot of shamans are kind of bitter and resentful over the state of the world today and things that have happened in the past between different cultural groups. And I'm not sure if I was bringing in someone who's new to mage and they got excited about a shaman, I'm not sure if I would put a strong emphasis on that bitter and resentful element of things. But I think it does have a very good place in chapter 1. And that is in Revised Era Mage, they are strongly, especially when we really get into the revised books, there's this emphasis that the leaders of the mage factions of the past made a lot of mistakes and the younger generation has a fresh mindset. There's a lot of hope that they will do things better. And so I thought it was appropriate to show these older leaders, you know, talking to a newer member saying, we're so unhappy about all these things that happened in the past and we carry this resentment. And then the younger member saying, okay, I get that, but I'm not sure I want to take on this part of our traditions of the past. And so it was appropriate. It made sense.
And even later it says, while we will forgive, we will not forget. And I think that's a really good way of putting it. And there are other places where it mentions we use the anger to drive us, and we ourselves do not necessarily have clean hands. The other thing that was kind of interesting about this chapter is, moving on to chapter 2, they indicate that the role of the modern shaman is to in some way roll back progress being in air quotes, where they see progress as anything that separates a person from their surroundings and the spirit environment they operate in. And I thought that was an interesting definition of progress to use. And again, that's one of those things that goes in scare quotes. I think a lot of people would be okay with a fair number of things about modern medicine and the fact that we've invented eyeglasses and so on. But just the idea that humans have become so removed from their surrounding that they don't understand the physical world and understand their own bodies is certainly something I can get behind. And that the goal of the shaman is to reconnect those and to find the power and importance of connecting those. The next section goes through the fact that most shamanic beliefs will have some sort of sacred center, that there is an object, idea, entity, place that connects the various realms, and that the shaman is a person that gets to move between them. There is some sort of middle realm, the earth realm, which represents where we are. There is some sort of heavens above, which is where spirits or the gods or dreaming occurs. And then there is a land of the dead. And one of the things I liked is that the book specifically pointed out that this doesn't exactly match mage cosmology, but if you squint a little bit, you can make it work. And I really liked that admission, that it was like, yeah, at first blush, this may not make sense, but to most shamanic practitioners, there is no difference between a few of these areas. So the fact that some people are like, we have the high umbra and the penumbra and the epiphanes, and they're like, well, they're probably going to view a couple of these as basically variants on the same place. So this works out in the end. They go through a bunch of spirit theories. They go through what a few of the dominant paradigms are regarding what spirits are, in that oh, is this a fundamentally separate world that we have become separated from? Are these emanations of the Jungian archetype? And what do you consider spirits to be? Which I thought was a useful conversation. Anytime the mage books say, here's a whole bunch of different interpretations of the exact same thing, I think that makes it easier for me as a storyteller to do my role. And then that little subsection ends with a thing that says, play up paradigm. And that may be something that mage has said any number of times, but it banged on about the fact that every mage is going to have a paradigm. And even if two hermetics are talking about spirits, they are probably going to have slightly different views of what spirits are, how they should be interfaced with, and what they really represented. And I really like that. Just the idea that we should not use a tradition as just this homogenous lump of people, which is something I've banged down about for a while. But the book specifically called the reader that when they are creating a character, make sure their character has a personal understanding of spirits, if that is going to be a cornerstone of their paradigm. The next thing we get is a basic elements of what the shaman is going to do and how they're going to do it. We get a tour of drugs and why they're so important. And the discussion of being that when you consume something, you're also consuming its spirit. So psychoactive plants are in some cultures viewed as having very potent plant spirit. Suddenly the idea of a psychogenic plant being sacred in that regard makes total sense. We get the idea of augmentation, that a shaman can temporarily gain several powers from having a spirit tag along. And this is something that I thought was flavorful and interesting, but also I could totally understand a storyteller not wanting to do that because a player might be like, free dots! To me, there are a bunch of systematic ways of dealing with this, of having the idea that, oh, you're taking upon the spirit. Either take it as, okay, this is just a manifestation of your normal sphere abilities, or this is something that's going to have to be paid back, or generally the way I view it would be you are more or less taking on a spirit and temporarily gaining powers as if you had got access to a wonder or a talisman or something like that. That goes away and is something your character no longer has access to. I wish it would have included recommendations on how to balance that. The next key roles we get are talking with the dead and how that should occur, what the basic parts of that process are. I did like the part where it pointed out this is actually a lot more boring than you think it is because the dead tend to be talkers. And then we get a extended section on what shaman wear and how each part of that regalia is important and symbolically important. Most of them have some sort of hat. Most of them have some sort of way of creating music. That many pick up parts of dress that allow them to emulate a animal or an idea that they are trying to take power from. And then we get a walkthrough kind of what is the state of shamanic practice around the world. And this is one of those things where, again, it is forgive but don't forget. It talks about the recent tragedies that have occurred over the past 500 years to the indigenous people of North America, or how Islam has raided sub-Saharan Africa, or some and other such changes globally. And then finally, we get what I think was one of the more interesting things: how shamanic practice intersects with all the other factions of the Ascension War. We get a walkthrough of how shamanic practice fits into the traditions, as well as what it is like within the Nefandi, which I found fascinating to talk about how there was this weird combination of shamanic practice plus the Order of Hermes that was behind the Black Lodges of Germany. And I'm like, cool. That's every book needs to reference fairies or Nazis. We got our Nazis reference. What did you think about chapter 2?
Page 37 talked about the idea that the technocracy is terrified that other mage factions are going to tell the public about spirit realms or alternate universes. And I thought that was a little ridiculous. It even said that the technocracy is so terrified that if these other mages start telling people, they're going to step up the program and kill off those mages. It's like, okay, this makes the technocracy look a little too fragile and worked up over minor things to me. So I didn't like that.
It felt a little one-y, where it's like, we can't let them know that fairies exist. But at the same time, I get it. It's one of those things where it just kind of reminds me of like the Chinese Communist Party, where it's like, this thing vaguely looks like this other thing that could remind people of this other thing. We can't let it happen. And you're like, oh, this is ridiculous. And then you're like, oh, wait, that happened in real life.
There was the section on augmentation, which is a new system for magic rules. And I actually didn't like that. I mean, I like the idea of, the belief in the spirit within a plant. And when you ingest it, the spirit comes into you. And some spirits are very strong in a very little package, and it gives you more abilities. I like that idea. I'm not against that. But augmentation specifically, as you can use a sphere at a dot higher than you have because you did this thing. I'm not in favor of that. I think there are just better ways to go about this concept in the game. And so specifically the system of augmentation, as a storyteller, I would not encourage that. It carries this assumption that we find all through second and revised edition that players are going to portray mages that are very connected to a real world cultural or ethnic group. It just makes that assumption. And, I like the idea in first edition where mages, after they awaken, they take in so much information that they take on a new perspective and they see a need to make new cultural and pseudo-ethnical groups. And so, I think it's cool if a player came to me and said, oh, I want to be this kind of shaman that's part of this group that is not reflected in real-world cultures. I'd say, yeah, we can run with that. That's fine. Again, this chapter goes into history, and it only talks about real-world history. There's no hidden World of Darkness secret mage history that I so enjoyed in earlier books. And it just wasn't here. And it would have been so fun to see some of that stuff. Some stuff that mages talk about that sleepers just don't know about. Now, here's an idea we saw in Chapter 2 of representation. Terry and I have spoken about this in past episodes before. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But in certain mage books, authors make this assumption that a mage faction somehow represents or symbolically represents a real world group of people that did something in the past in the real world. And so in here we get the idea that the Akashic Brotherhood represents Buddhism. And so everything that Buddhists have done around the world is so closely connected to what the Akashic Brotherhood was trying to accomplish. And I just don't see that. In fact, in our Akashic Brotherhood episode, we talked about how the Akashic Brotherhood has some thematic connections to a subset within Buddhism, but for them to represent all of Buddhism didn't seem sensible to me. Also, throughout this chapter, there's this strong idea that the Celestial Chorus represents all of Christianity and is responsible for all things that all Christians have done in the past, and I just don't see that. Especially after reading the Celestial Chorus tradition book, it just doesn't connect. Now, towards the end of this chapter, they talk about the Order of Descent, and that is basically a group of evil shamans, and they left it vague on, are they officially recognizably part of the Nefandi, or are they just their own group that ends up operating very much like Nefandi? And I like that. It's like, don't codify that. Don't make it specific. And this idea that shamanism doesn't always lead to virtue. Sometimes it leads to vice. It's like, okay, that is really cool. Order of descent. It's like shamans have their own shaman villains that they're paying attention to and you can bring into games. It's like, I thought that was so cool. Really liked that.
Yeah, and I liked the techno-shamanic discussions where they talked about the pantheists within the Society of Ether, that they were talking about, hey, there are even formal representations of this, that if you take something like the Gaia hypothesis and decide to represent the world systematically, that there is this gestalt that you can have access to. And it just so happens that this bears a striking resemblance to what we would traditionally call spirits. Likewise with techno-shamanism among the virtual adepts, where when they say something like kill your television, they mean it in a spiritual sense, that there is a nature and essence to it that may be abstracted digitally that we see as a spirit that you can interact with. I thought that was fascinating when they talked about the Sumerian revival within the Order of Hermes, where they're like, oh no, we're just doing straight Hermeticism, and then you look at it closely and you're like, yeah, sure you are, buddy. But Adam brings up a good point. It always feels like lazy writing of when you're saying this tradition represents this group of people, and the book specifically has the following line, which I wish were in 20-foot high letters across a lot of mage publications, which says, so what happened to shamanic people? This is after the section where it basically goes over all the indigenous cultures that have been crushed by progress over time. So what happened to shamanic people? We cast blame, but we must remember, if a group of mages has done a thing, then a group of people has done so 10,000-fold. So yes, there were probably members of the chorus who did something, but at the end of the day, it was bog standard mortals who wound up doing the vast majority of that legwork. And I appreciate that periodic reminder. Chapter 3, we get a walkthrough of the other worlds. This is a combination of what we got in Book of Worlds, plus what we got in some tradition books, plus what we got in the core rulebook. And it talks about what the low umbra looks like to a shaman, and the high umbra, and the Aetherian reaches. And we get a side note that there are certain realms that only werewolves can go to. And I just didn't care about it because it was all stuff that we had seen before. It was in slightly more detail than we got in some places, but overall in less detail than Book of Worlds. I am glad it is here because Spirit Ways is a book that if a player's like, I want to play this shamanic character type, I can literally just hand them this. I don't even need to give you a tradition book. This is like a super tradition book that covers a whole bunch of things. And for that, I love it. But as a storyteller, this was very much retreaded material. We get a reminder of the different ways that you can interact with the other worlds across the spirit and mind sphere, which I found useful just as a reminder, oh, by the way. But there are a lot of other interesting things that are also in Chapter 3. One is a list of blessings and curses of being a shaman. This is a list of systematic things that a character may get for choosing to be a shamanic character. It is easier for you to understand the minds of animals. It is easier for you to make fetishes. You can dream walk, which allows you to use Spirit 3 without mind to visit the dream realms. And I'm a big fan of any time a worldview or a paradigm is systematized in kind of a new way. There are some curses as well where you have to deal with bleed over. This is something that kind of came up in the book for the Cult of Ecstasy, where sometimes you're not always completely present or you're focusing your senses on a distant place or another world. You're probably more prone to quiet. Periodically, the spirits will make requests of you, which are terribly inconvenient, and also that you are more likely to manifest resonance or what otherwise I would call echoes flaws, that there tends to be waking dreams and powerful visions that come over you and may manifest in the real world in a couple of ways. We get a section on propitiation, which is the exchange that you do and how that should be proportional. I would have appreciated some examples of, if you want this, you should probably do something like this, just kind of to set precedent on what should be expected. We get a conversation about the relationship between shamans and shifters and talking about, yeah, they have better relations with werewolves and other shifting breeds than most other mages, but really that's not saying much considering how bad their relations are. This relation is very region specific, that someone may be familiar with the shifters in their area, and that does not give them like diplomatic immunity when they travel. And then finally, at least what I found interesting was the discussion of the world tree and the ancestral homelands. And this is the idea that originally there was a real thing, as real as anything is in Mage, that connected the worlds. And that as reality calcified, this thing pulled back from mundane reality out of self-protection, that the Outer Bowl or Mount Meru or any number of those connecting myths was really here on the earth and just out of self-defense kind of withdrew. And it talks about how there are certain realms that are kind of connected through this object. Periodically, you will see tree branches and tree trunks in the Null Zone, that there are primal manifestations of it in the Labyrinth and the Umbra. The Radiance and the Well of Souls are fundamentally connected through this, and that to me was a new and interesting idea, and I thought it was pretty cool. What did you like about Chapter 3?
There was a lot of desire to use in-character fiction, and I think it made it take longer to explain things than it needed to. I mean, there's one section of in-character fiction that basically says, don't assume that dream speakers and were creatures get along great. Sometimes dream speakers need to avoid were creatures because they're dangerous. It's like, didn't we all know this? I mean, I'm pretty sure we all knew this. But even still, I mean, one small paragraph really does a great job of getting that across. I really liked the idea where the mentor shaman is talking to a student shaman, and the mentor shaman says, yeah, we know about the High Umbra, but it's less interesting. There's less there that we care about. I mean, it's just a representation of something we can really get into here in the Middle Umbra, and so we don't waste a lot of time there. I mean, why would you? And it's like, yeah, I like this. This makes sense to me. I can see how shamans would take that point of view, and I think it adds a little game balance between different mage factions, and so I liked that. But then later in the book, they say again and again that, no, the shamans are all over the High Umbra. And it's like, well, okay, it could be construed as being a little inconsistent with the in-character fiction. Page 62 is talking about shamans. It says, quote, they are the undisputed masters of all things spiritual, end quote. And it's like, well, not in my chronicles. In my chronicles, there is no faction that is the undisputed master of all things spiritual. Different factions are good at different things, and they have different strengths to bring to the table. And so I don't really get excited about that line. Towards the end of the chapter, there's a big section where they basically rehash Book of Worlds. And even if you don't have Book of Worlds, there's the second edition core book that covers a lot of this. It's like you gave a lot of space here to stuff that we've already seen multiple times in past mage books. And so if you only have very few mage books, then it's nice that this is the one-stop shop for all things shaman. That's good. But if you have these other mage books, then there's a lot of retread, especially in chapter 3.
I got the feeling that this book, more so than most, was intended on being player-focused and like player-facing. And I have certainly run into the scenario where a player is at my table and they are playing someone from a indigenous culture and they're like, oh man, my character would obviously get along super well with werewolves. And I understand that storytellers would probably quickly figure out that like, no, werewolves. But having a section that's player-facing to be like, one, it's probably not as good a relationship as you think. They probably just hate you less. And that relieves the storyteller of having to do that. Also, there are these other things to worry about. Also, if you do want to run with werewolves, get ready to deal with Special Products Division and Pentex, which you are in no way equipped for. It did feel like a retreading in a lot of cases, but to me, like Book of Worlds, I think felt storyteller facing more so than player facing. That is at least the justification I am using for a lot of this stuff being retreaded. This, I had trouble following the in-character fiction sometimes. Like I wasn't literally quite sure what was happening, but that's because I'm bad at fiction in a lot of cases. But
yeah, I can see the point you're making. And one thing I really liked about this book that was kind of a throwback, at least to me, was the student in the student shaman in the in-character fiction was very much a middle-class white boy from a big city in America. But he had the spiritual callings, he had the dreams, got pulled into the dream speakers, and then this mentor shaman who actually, it says, came over from Africa and took him on as a student and treats him great. And it's like, I really like this, okay? I think this is very cool. In one sense, it's a little bit of a throwback to the beginning 1993 first edition dream speakers, and that is any person from any walk of life, any ethnic group can be a dream speaker. It's about, the spiritual calling. It's not about how you were born. So I thought that was cool. And also there is a specific mention in the first Dream Speakers tradition book where it says, sometimes we take white people as students, and when we do, we don't treat them very nice to reinforce the point we're trying to make. And I was like, is that a great thing? And then this book is like, no. When they have this calling, we bring them in. They're one of us. We're all good. It's like, that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the aspects of hope in Mage, that we can simultaneously remember that our characters have cultures and heritages, and those influence the world around us. But also, if we're going to bring about ascension, we probably need to be able to get along on some level. So would I feel comfortable storytelling that? Not necessarily in all cases, but I like seeing it within the books. Chapter 4, Spirit Helpers. This is a big honkin' chapter giving you the how-to, and it says you will have a totem. And I love that this section opens with the mentor just screwing with their student, where the student's like, it's like, oh no, your totem is the first thing you talk to. I talk to a squirrel. Does that mean my totem's a squirrel? And he's like, nah, I'm just screwing with you. You'll find something else. And I really liked that because, not to say that these practices aren't serious, but there's this kind of like false formalism that tends to infect certain paradigms, and anything that cuts that tension a little bit while still maintaining the importance of it, I really like. Like, even within the Hermetic book, there were a bunch of like tongue-in-cheek jokes about someone being like, oh, will this guy ever shut up? Sometimes we're so boring. And I thought that was important. And likewise here, a little bit of humor I thought helped cut things. And it starts out with what I think is a really useful walkthrough of the types of spirits. This is something that is mentioned elsewhere, and specifically this is Middle Umbra spirits, where you're dealing with the Celestine Incarna Jagling dichotomy as opposed to maybe the titles that are used in the High Umbra. And it talks about how Celestines are powerful but narrow. They know nothing outside of their purview. And the example is, if you talk to Mars about how to end pollution, the embodiment of war will just tell you tactics. And they will be brilliant and glorious tactics, but they will not actually pertain to your question. And how, outside of very narrow windows, it's actually really hard to get anything useful out of a Celestine. And I really liked that. Below them are the Incarna, which are much more personable, and less distant and much less powerful, and that they will often have different aspects of them, that whenever you meet an embodiment of an Incarna, they are part of a whole, and that a mage will never see the whole Incarna. Totems are generally incarna, and you may want to have them help you with a very long-term goal, but you will never quite understand them. Below them are jaglings, which are generally singular entities. When you encounter a jagling, it is usually just that jagling, and they are listed as mage level. Not to say that they're the same power level, but they're within kind of the same range band. They may be extensions or they may be independent, in the sense that you may encounter a jagling which is a manifestation of an incarna, or it may just be a free-range jagling that has its own agenda and never deals with an associated incarna that it is a part of. And below that, you have gafflings, which often look up to mages. So I like the idea of having like a very low power gaffling game where they might have on their character sheets dots in mage patron. And I just liked that as an idea. I have no idea how you would actually do that. And then it spoke about the different kinds of relationships that you will have. That to spirits, it is often one of aid and confederation, that they'll help you, you'll help them. And you share friends lists, you share enemies lists, that there are things that you can do that will help or harm that. And it gives you a little list of what those things could be. And one of the things that I thought was fascinating was a constant argument I hear is that werewolves don't like mages having access to fetishes because that is the magical items that are empowered by a spirit containing them that lets them use their charm. That werewolves see this as mages taking advantage of spirits or imprisoning them. And it gives two counters to that. One is spirits like feeling useful just like everyone else. And being bound into a fetish for a short period of time, or being in a talon, Talen, a one-time use small item, gives the spirit an opportunity to do its thing. If you're a snake spirit and your goal is to poison people and you're in a fetish that is used to poison people, you get to do your thing. And spirits like doing that. The other one was when a spirit is bound into a fetish, they gain access to the material world, that they can sense what is around them. And for them, it is a field trip. It is their version of going into a diving cage to swim with sharks. It is their version of putting on a spacesuit. And I loved that. I think the final note for me in chapter 4 that I thought was really interesting was the list of pretty well the two cases where shamans and technocrats work together. And they talk about large outbreaks of the worm, and the other one was odd problems in the deep umbra. And I really liked it that periodically something like a powerful bane, like a nexus crawler or a scrag from werewolf will manifest. And that is the one time where the Seatsie from the Void Engineers picks up the phone, calls, uses the shaman signal, and everyone has to go into the deep umbra to beat up these people. I want to see that game. That is I feel like that is the closest we've gotten in second edition to the storyteller screen from first edition, where it's just a bunch of weird people in space with guns and you have no idea what's going on.
Chapter 4 had a number of interesting things. The section on Celestines being very simple-minded and very limited. I can see how this is a very useful narrative device for making Celestines be more distant and unapproachable, and I can see a reason why storytellers would want to do that. However, I don't always want to do that in my game. Sometimes I want a chance for exchanges with Celestines. And so the idea of linking essences, avatar essences, to the sort of relationship you have with your totem, I thought that was really cool. I thought that was very insightful, very interesting, gives a lot of stuff for storytellers to play with when setting up seekings and other exchanges with their players. So bonus points for that. I also really liked this idea of the shaman being a patron for a lesser gaffling spirit. I thought that was so interesting. It's like, okay, you've got the relationship between the totem and the mage, but then you can like turn it around and face the other direction and have it between a mage and a gaffling. I thought that is so cool. That would be such a fun thing to play with. And it enriches the whole umbral dimension for me. So in the section of aids and confederates, it presents the bartering with spirits in the sense that there's a hard line, there's a wall separating asking a spirit to do something for you and, quote, use their own magic, end quote. And maybe I'm taking this the wrong way, but it seemed like it was taking subtlety and nuance of what kind of magic shamans are doing, and it sort of tossed it out the window. It's like either you ask the spirit to do it for you, or you do it yourself. It's like I like this subtle idea of the mage using his magic, and he doesn't see the spirit, but he has this belief that, well, yeah, I have this agreement with the spirit, and it came and it did this thing for me. And if I ever piss off the spirit, I expect my sphere magic to stop working. I can't use it anymore. And it's not necessarily true, but it's their belief. Mm-hmm. It's their paradigm. I thought that was so cool. And this section, Aids and Confederates, and I'm not sure if they were really connecting with that the same way that I connect with that as a mage fan, but it was just one line. It's not like a clamping down on a system or introducing a new system, but I thought it was worth bringing up.
The next section is the appendix, and boy howdy, does this have a bunch going on. This uses the standard 2E description of the first chapter. The first paragraph is a explanation of what is happening in world, and then in square brackets you get system. And it goes through a lot of shamanic rotes, for lack of a better term. As with everything in second edition, I'm not quite sure about necessarily the spheres that are chosen to do something, but hands down, I think my favorite rote in this is the interestingly named Dream Quest, which is the idea that this is something that's been alluded to in Mage, and I feel like is more prominent in Werewolf, that both the mundane side of reality will influence the penumbra, and the penumbra will influence the mundane side of reality. I feel like in Mage, we mostly focus on that first one, that mundane reality influences the penumbra, but this is a rote, and it's got dots for days, spirit 3 or 4, prime 2, entropy 2, mind 2 or 4, prime 2, entropy 2, that the characters can undertake a very large game-spanning quest, for lack of a better term, to change the penumbra, to cause the mundane side of reality to change in a fundamental way. I think this is a fascinating idea. It is not a chronicle I would ever want to run, just because I don't want characters to spend that much time in the Umbra. That's just me. But to encounter mages or entities that are doing this, I think is a fascinating plot idea. That you have a bunch of Nefandi or Void Engineers or whatever the antagonist group is, making this large-scale subtle change to the penumbra to try and affect mundane reality and shift it in their direction, I thought was super interesting. The next thing we get are tools, and these are semi-magical items, as in they are not systematized in the same way necessarily as a talisman, but they do give abilities that are expressed in terms of spheres. We got a few magic items, and I thought those were pretty fascinating. We get proper fetishes, which we don't get a huge number of throughout Mage, the various masks and implements of shamanic practice that can be useful within your game. And in addition to that, we also get regular talismans. And then it adds lesser talismans. And a lesser talisman they describe as a magical aid that helps a mage perform a single rote. And that unlike a normal focus, this is something to do one thing and to do it very well. And this is something I waffled back and forth on. I kind of like the idea that there is an effect that a mage wants to do that is normally time-consuming or difficult to them, that they can spend time, craft a lesser talisman, and suddenly that particular effect becomes a little bit easier to do. That maybe normally when you do healing magic, it requires you to have a special tent and to have ointments and unguents around you, but after a while, you're like, this is just wildly impractical. I'm going to spend a lot of time and create this other object. The example they give here is a healing tube, which is a narrow metal or bone tube that helps suck out illness. And I thought that was thematically interesting. I have no idea what it would look like in my game if a character asked for it. And then the book ended with a bunch of merits and flaws. And I thought these were interesting. And it did something that almost feels like it was that M20 did a lot of recommending bundles of merits and flaws, that somebody with shamanic authority is likely to have a spiritual duty on the other side of things, that a character that is spiritually noticeable may be more likely to have second sight or spirit vision as a power or thing that they can have. And I thought that was interesting. We get some information at the end about the background totem, which I just use the term spirit patron now in M20 that I think makes more sense. We got a cluster of systems. My big problem with this is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for instance, one of the rotes involves rolling manipulation plus animal ken, and I don't think mages have animal ken in second edition. but
it may have been referring to a secondary skill from the Book of Shadows. They do that a lot in later second edition books, I've noticed.
Okay.
And they just assume that players love all of those skills. And Terry and I talked about that in the episode on Book of Shadows.
Do you want to make your characters more specific, less powerful, and require more books? Have we got a system for you?
The appendix was big. There was a lot here. This is really the value adder section of the book. This is the part of the book that after you've read it and you kind of understand what's going on months later, you're going to pull it off the shelf and refer to things in the appendix. There were a lot of rotes in here. I thought they were clever and appropriate for shamans, and so I liked a lot of the rotes that I read through. I thought that was good stuff. You mentioned what it discusses in this book of if you do something in the penumbra, it's going to affect the physical world and vice versa. I remember how in the in-character fiction they go into the penumbra and they say, oh, the trees are so big here because the trees here are like before Europeans got here. So it's like we're seeing the past of the physical world in the penumbra. And so I thought, well, what if a storyteller wanted to take that further and say, look, the gauntlet is a time slow between one side or the other. And so if you do something on one side, it will affect the other, but the gauntlet will slow down its effect on the other side. And I don't have a specific system for that, but I thought that was an interesting idea that a storyteller could play with if they like it. The spirit drugs I thought were really, really interesting. It's like it's not just a drug. It is like a talon, a one-shot fetish or a one-shot talisman. And so they actually use quintessence to make it. And so it gives a pumped up, spiritual, not spiritual, but it's pumped up magical ability to you when you use it. I thought that is really cool. I would love to see this kind of thing brought over for the potions of Hermetics and Children of Knowledge, Solificati, and other mage factions.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the Wulong could use stuff like this. It was odd to me that they list a lot of fetishes, but they make no mention of the sort of spirit that lives in the fetish. Because when you're running a game session, that's kind of part of the fun of using a fetish. It's not just like an electronic device where you hit the button and it does the thing and you put it down and forget about it. A fetish is like there's a spirit in there and it's got its own personality and its own feelings about things, and that can, even if it's not talking, it still comes into the scene. So that was a bit odd that there's no mention of what spirit lives in this fetish that we're describing for you. Also, I was faced with the problem of when it says that shamans treat spirits right, they don't abuse them. However, when there's a really bad spirit and it's causing trouble, they will bottle it up and force it into being a useful fetish instead of running around causing problems. And it's like, okay, well, here's something to keep in mind. Shamans are people. Sometimes they tell you the truth, sometimes they lie. Shamans have a whole lot of respect for spirits. So what happens when a shaman meets another shaman who's got this fetish, and the fetish is saying, I was bottled up in here, this is injustice, this guy's abusing me. It's like, so the shaman who's meeting this other guy, who does he trust? The spirit of the shaman. It's like, hey, I don't know about this one. I mean, it seems like a bad shaman could really abuse a whole lot of spirits, then go meet other shamans and say, no, he was a bad spirit, man. I had to do this, man. If you would have been there, if you would have seen it. The notoriety system introduced in this book, I believe it was in the appendix. I thought that was useful. It's a simple system where you can bring in, dots and dice to notoriety. And notoriety is a shaman does something bad and he becomes known among other shamans and spirits for being a shaman who does things the wrong way, and we shouldn't be as nice to him as to the good shamans. So that was a little system it's optional, but it's handy, and I like that it was here. Lesser talismans that's a whole discussion of its own. I'm just going to say that I wasn't really crazy about it. I think it's because on a thematic level, I like the idea of the dynamic mages doing things different than the very, rote following, memorizing hedge wizards. And so it's like, to me, lesser talismans felt like mages are turning themselves into hedge wizards in a sense. And so I was not crazy about that. Plus, it adds complexity and more rules information for things that, as a storyteller, I would do another way. So I didn't really like lesser talismans, but I'm not going to tell you that you shouldn't use them in your games. You might find a lot here. When it came to merits and flaws, I also like the idea of pairing a merit with a flaw. A player of mine was doing that a while back before the idea was really well introduced, and it worked well. But there are a number of merits and flaws in this section that I probably wouldn't use in my games. I think they're too complex or they pull things in the wrong direction, and so it was hard for me to get excited for a lot of these merits and flaws.
So now the overall book. I thought this book was great. It had a lot of stuff. There are some parts that were a little bit chunky, but boy, howdy, does it do that thing that some books do where they're just like, we're just going to give you a lot of stuff. They gave you 6 to 10 worldviews. They gave you more than one set of in-character stories that you're following over it. The appendix was nice and thick. It explained parts of the world that I think would be hard or difficult sometimes, like the whole Celestine and Karna Jagling Gaffling thing. The relationship with other groups. It mentioned other night folk without doing the thing where it's like, well, we're going to make this aside, but you also need these 17 other books to do it. I thought the writing was relatively tight. I thought the editing was a little bit problematic in certain places, where there were parts where just like the formatting fell apart. It's not quite as visually well put together as some of the previous books. There are areas with a lot of white page to it, but I mean, just in terms of a book I would get for $9.95, I think it's great. And I hadn't read it before now. It's kind of a peek at something that I wish we had more in the M20 line. This is a big paradigm book. It doesn't quite explain how the spheres would be expressed, and that to me was the one thing that wasn't really discussed, either recommended spirits or lists or practices that would tie back to that. But that's really my only thing that would prevent me from handing this book to a player and being like, here's everything you need outside of character creation for the systems that pertain to your character's worldview, plus whatever research you do on your own to explain it. I like the shamanic societies within, or the shamanic practices within each tradition. Anything that makes the tradition larger than a stereotype, I think improves it immensely. And that was great. The art was fine. I thought that was perfectly enjoyable. One of my favorite illustrations in all of Mage is page 46, where there is a girl with a beanie hat on top of a garbage can with a cane, and there is a something talking to her. And I think that is a good summary of Mage. And also, this was a book that came out in 1999. We're about to hit a new millennium, and I'm just kind of excited to see where it goes. The fact that Revised happened before Revised, and this book kind of is also leaning into that to say not all shamans are dream speakers, not all dream speakers are necessarily this type of shaman. And I'm just super excited to see Mage open up in certain ways, and this book kind of started that.
It was interesting because I think this is the first Mage book to talk about a practice, like a way of doing magic that does not connect to a specific faction. I think, but this is like a practice. It's like, hey, there's some orphans doing this, there's some traditions doing this, there's some disparates doing this. It's a way of doing magic, and it doesn't connect to one or two factions. And so it being a little new, I can see how a Mage fan reading through the books would kind of take a bit to wrap their mind around that. But as for the book overall, I liked it. I didn't like how much of this was retread. I think if they had knocked out the retread and shortened down the book, and it would have been a lot sweeter. But there is a lot of new material here. There's a lot of optional systems here that you can add, but you don't need to add. And so I thought that was great. So it's worth picking up. That appendix, it's long and it's action packed. So definitely worth having. When Mage started back in 1993, I thought it was interesting how it really focused on the High Umbra, and I talked about how most Mage factions really spend their time in the High Umbra, but then you got these Dream Speakers and they go to the Middle Umbra. They're a little different. And then you see as the books, years go by and more Mage books come out, it's just funny how the Mage authors really loved the Middle Umbra. It's like they understood it, they got it, they liked it, it connected for them. It was firing on all pistons. And there are less books talking about the High Umbra, which when Mage started out, that was like where Mage was focused. And as time went on, it's like that focus kind of subtly shifted over to the Middle Umbra. For example, we have a whole book saying, here's a whole bunch of spirits from the Middle Umbra. And we don't have that for the High Umbra. I can actually see a totem relationship limiting a shaman. The spirit binds the Mage to a strict paradigm, frowning on new ideas, even new allies. It seems like if you want that tension and you want to role play that, that's a great opportunity. But if you're not looking for it, then I don't know, you might want to keep that in mind. It's like I can really see how a totem spirit would limit a mage's possibilities, their ideas, what is and is not okay. If a mage wants to branch out and try something different or make a whole new set of friends, the totem might go, no, I don't like those people. You do what I say and do things my way. There was the large sidebar that took up 2 pages saying, if you want to play this kind of shaman, you get these advantages and these disadvantages. I thought it was cool to offer that. I'm certainly not against that in any way, but it seemed to me that a lot of the benefits are things that a player would latch on to. The advantages. The player would latch on to that and say, look, I get this. I'm going to defend my right to use these advantages because that's why I took this character. But as for the disadvantages, a lot of them are going to happen off camera, or they're going to be additional complexity dropped on the storyteller. And the storyteller is going to think either, I don't want to mess with this additional set of rules right now, or look, I'm running a plot, I'm going in a certain direction, I got all these other players to deal with. These disadvantages I'm supposed to push on this one shaman character. Why don't I just push that to the background so I've got more time to really focus on what I want to focus on? So I think that you can quietly end up with a situation where the player is getting their advantages and not getting a lot of their disadvantages. And so a storyteller has to really be on board and really want to do this, or a lot of the bad things will slip and the good things won't.
And it seems like one of those things that the rest of the table has to be comfortable with. It's kind of like if a character takes a very big flaw, the rest of the table needs to be in on that. Like, if you're part of a group where one of the characters has dark fate as a flaw, guess what? You have dark fate as a flaw now too. And just like if a spirit can periodically come out of nowhere and demand service from the shaman, if the characters generally stick together, well, guess what? you now have to deal with Uyoja, like Scion of Mice or whatever it is.
Yeah, but I don't want to make this as an argument as, totem shamans are no good. This is why I should avoid them. I think there is an alternative, and that is put a little less emphasis on the advantages, put a little less emphasis on the disadvantages. And as a storyteller, I might even take the totem and put it in the player's hands and say, look, this is a great idea, but I'm going to trust you to be mature enough to role play not only the good stuff, but the bad stuff and a lot of the personality that makes it interesting. So, tell us what your totem is pushing you into, and let's all, approach it from that direction.
I think one of the things the book really did well for me, and again, Adam and I have been reading books at this point for years and playing the game for decades. The book did a simple reminder that one of the powers in Mage is that whenever you are playing a culture that is different than your own, you get to view things as an outsider. There is a little thing about a character walking through and encountering a primal ritual with people who were oddly dressed and were screaming at one another in a special room. And it turns out they were in a trading pit, and one group was yelling buy, 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 and the other group was yelling sell, sell, sell. And the shaman saying he immediately recognized what was going on here. This was a primal invocation of the spirits going towards some of humanity's basest needs. And I'm like, oh, that's really neat. The ability to view things as an outsider, in the same way that there are comics that are often from the point of view of aliens or from spirits or from household objects. And part of what the humor comes from is the observations on human life. And a shamanic character very much gets to do that. And they also mention how shamans have a benefit in that their stories can come seemingly from anywhere. And the example they give is a dragon in someone's spleen could be causing tennis elbow. And just the ability to kind of pull story out of thin air, if everyone's on board from it, is something that I really liked.
One thing that I would say is notoriety could be a little tough to work with, because what makes a spirit a bad spirit by human standards might be very different by spirits' standards. And so if a shaman takes a spirit that's causing a lot of havoc and all shamans agree this is a bad spirit, needs to be put down, then he bottles it up or does whatever to limit it. And then other spirits are like, hey, that was one of our boys doing a very necessary thing, and you just stomped on our whole system here, and we don't like you now. And so it's like, notoriety, you can see it from the human's point of view, see it from the spirit's point of view, and that can add richness to your role-playing. It can also make things a little hard to interpret. So I thought that was worth mentioning.
My guess is it does that thing that you talked about before, which I thought was interesting, about having an idea of, is power within your nature, or is power something that you can acquire? The former being the shamanic view of things, and the latter being a more hermetic view of things, that you can do your homework, you can do your push-ups, and you can get stronger. And that your character may consider a spirit to be bad if they are going against the order of nature, where other spirits may be wrong, may think a spirit is bad because the spirit is uppity or something like that, where a spirit may be doing something good, but the spirits to them in the middle umbra are like, oh, you're doing something that is against your nature, that is problematic. But from the spirit's point of view, maybe the spirit just wants to grow and develop as a spirit. But that strikes me as great grist for the mage table mill.
Well, just the last part was sort of a musing on me musing on common themes of Mage. I guess one of the reason that I sort of question sometimes the later edition's strong focus on real-world magical practices is, at least for me, they don't always seem to mesh well with a lot of the mage concepts that fascinate me. For example, mages are supposed to guide reality, guide society to a newer and better way of doing things. But it seems like shamans are so connected with the spirit world. It's like on a thematic level, it seems like shamans surrender to the spirit world and say, your order is what I want to bring back and reinforce, and I will do what you tell me to do. And so as a storyteller, I would want to play with the idea of, as the player has been playing this shaman character for more time, and they've spent some experience points and spent some time learning things, that I want to role play this tension of the spirit saying, no, 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 the way we did it thousands of years ago is the way we always have to do it. And the shaman saying, look, I am a dynamic mage and I have a vision for a new way forward. And I might have to disagree with you spirits on that. They're saying you are turning your back on your duty as a shaman. And the shaman's saying, no, I think I'm really embracing my duty as a shaman. And that tension there of old versus new and personal versus collective, I think is something I would want to lean into for a character that's been in the world for a while.
Mm-hmm. And there's also the problem of one of the things that was mentioned early in first edition is the reason Mage doesn't adhere more to real world magical practices is, one, that is hard to represent at the game table. And two, you're dealing with, I am uncomfortable as a storyteller sometimes systematizing something that is considered sacred in another culture and be like, okay, I read and recited the entirety of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the most sacred text to my people. What happens now? You get a -1 difficulty. And that just to me as a storyteller is a little bit jarring. So yeah. I do like that the book is kind of like, here are the real world practices that inform this. These are the recommendations on the magical side on how to roll your own. And I cannot speak to whether or not someone would be offended by not using actual practices. But to me as a storyteller, I like there being at least a little bit of distance.
Well, I've got some adventure ideas if we're ready to roll in.
Let's adventure!
Okay. Number one of the players is given a fetish mask by a respected shaman. When the player uses it, she appears beside a fire in a primal forest and gains wisdom from the spirit of the mask. Allow the player to gain in cosmology enigmas or something appropriate. Whenever the player returns, she feels tired but exhilarated. The other players, or NPCs, tell the shaman she has been committing terrible acts while wearing the mask. The spirit is deceiving her. Whenever she wears the mask, the spirit within it takes over and causes havoc in the area. Is it random acts, or is the masked spirit working towards a goal? A rumor that the respected shaman is a member of the Order of Descent suddenly seems credible. Moving against the deceitful shaman will be difficult, as senior shamans all respect him. Number two, the shaman is pleased to learn about a vibrant community of his ethnic group in a big city. Soon after, he sees dreams where he sits before 2 bowls of his traditional food. He must choose one and reject the other, but he can't decide. Trouble follows. As shops are vandalized, people see frightening visions and other misfortunes occur. The shaman learns the spirits are doing this to make it clear the old ways must be enforced. Foods offered, large dances performed, shrines built, etc. But the people of the community don't want to do these things. They're just trying to get by and like their modern lives. In this personal story, the shaman must either convince the people to give up their time and money for the old ways, or, what may be more likely, find a way to talk the spirits into letting go. This is intended to be a more emotional, personal focused adventure idea for those who want to explore that. Number three, when the players are in the Umbra, they hear drums and see a mountain. An earthquake makes trees fall so that a path leads to the top of the mountain while the moon shines on the path. At the top of the mountain, thunder rumbles. In it, voices from the lodge in the sky, the oldest umbral court, speak. Each shaman in the group is asked to awaken the spirit of a city on Earth. If they carry the Lodge of the Sky's message to that city and bring the replies back to the mountaintop, they will be hearthstones in a new village. This is a metaphor. Let the players do other things while the shamans develop the skills and abilities needed to awaken the city spirits. The Lodge of the Sky is patient. This will be a good way for a storyteller to encourage shaman players to develop the skills appropriate to their calling and build respect among other shamans in the setting. And that's it for adventure ideas.
And my quote, this book had a bunch of very snappy writing in it. And one that I really liked is the fact that it talked about what magic felt like in very specific sensory ways. So my of this book is, I felt the unmistakable tingle of magic. Once you feel it, you never miss it. somewhere between a sudden static shock and the taste of hot chocolate, for me at least. And oh man, I just love that. That made me aware of an aspect of the game I had not been bringing to my table. It's not necessarily funny. It doesn't have to do with anyone's genitals, which is off-brand for me. I understand, but this is the sentence I will walk away with and try and bring to my table to try and evoke that in my players, and it made me excited for Mage again.
Yeah, definitely. So that's really the strength of good in-character fiction. It brings in these little bitty tangents you just have nothing to do with anything, but wow, they make you think. Well, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. You can subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and many other great aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too, and if you leave a review for Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in other people's searches. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there and see the complete show notes that we prepare for you with links. This episode is thanks to executive producers Ira Grace, Richard Batt Brewster, John Magnuson, Chris Zack, Christopher Phillips, Bryce Perry, Brendan Morrill, Andrew Katz, Michael Parker, Anders, and Justin. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes and keep everything rolling out to you. You could also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects for the future. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
Go change the world.